Welcome to An Honorable Profession, a podcast giving America hope since 2018. I'm Ryan Coonerty. Along with Debbie Cox-Bolton of the New Deal, I'm lucky enough to be your co-host. An Honorable Profession is a New Deal Leaders podcast. The New Deal is an organization that supports the next generation of American leaders. From attorneys generals to state senators to mayors to school board members, these are the people that are pushing policies and politics that will respond to climate change, rebuild our economy, address racial injustice, and restore our democracy. These are incredibly talented people who have dedicated themselves to public service when their country and their communities needed it the most. Check out newdealleaders.org to see what I'm talking about. Oklahoma Representative Arturo Alonso-Sandoval ran for office during his senior year of college. He's a mechanical engineer, but instead of getting a good job solving tough engineering problems, he felt the need to serve his community. We talk about that path to service, advocating for his underserved community, fighting draconian anti-immigrant laws, and shaping AI policy. He's a reminder of why we need more diverse voices at tables where policies are made. Enjoy. Oklahoma Representative Arturo Alonso-Sandoval, welcome to An Honorable Profession.
Hey, thanks for having me.
I want to start, you ran for office during your senior year of college. Most people would be maybe having some parties, looking for jobs. You chose to run. Tell me about that decision and tell me a little bit about what it's like to be the youngest member in the legislature.
For sure. No, and I appreciate you the question. Again, thank you for having me in y'all's podcast. I can definitely say when it comes to my path towards service was a little non-traditional, right? I think a lot of people that I work with, they typically get their career and then they decide to, run for office. I kind of did a little bit of the opposite. 2 years ago, I was finishing my last semester at OU, the University of Oklahoma. And I got my undergrad in mechanical engineering. So for the longest, I'm a big space fan. So grew up watching things like Star Wars, big into robotics and STEM. So that was kind of always my goal, to serve, but through the realm of science, technology. And as I was finishing my last semester at OU, there was a group of leaders that reached out to me with an opportunity. And at first I'm like, okay, what opportunity are they talking about? And these were people that I had kind of just grown up working with since whenever I was in middle school, high school, I did a lot of volunteering. I volunteered within my community because I come from a part of Oklahoma City, which is the capital of Oklahoma, that tends to be more lower income families. It's a predominantly Hispanic community. And you just see a lot of the needs, a lot of the issues that a community like mine face. It's predominantly low-income families. There's a lot of barriers when it comes to resources. So growing up, seeing your family struggle in different ways, I was like, okay, what can I do to give back? And at the time, I didn't have a lot of money. So I was like, I'm gonna give my time and I'm gonna give my energy and I'm gonna mobilize my friends to do some good. And that meant, volunteering for nonprofit organizations, getting with leaders within the community that were just trying to do as much as they could to pour into families like mine. So eventually I ran into someone that was running for office. He was an immigration lawyer that had helped my family out a little bit. And I was like, this guy's a good person, has a good heart, and I'm going to do what I can to help him get elected. I didn't know too much about what politics kind of looked like in Oklahoma at the time. But I knew, with hard work, we could do some kind of change. And it was kind of a full circle. So a lot of the people that I met throughout my path, serving as a volunteer, as someone that would kind of just organize my peers within my school and within my community, those same people were the ones that reached out to me. So whenever the seat became vacant, the seat I currently serve in, I was one of the person they called. And at first I'm like, okay, we have the conversation like, hey, have you ever thought about running for office? And I'm like, no. So first off, I'm an engineer. Engineers tend to be some of the more politically disengaged people because I think the logic, the rationale, those things tend to fly out the window in the world of politics. So a lot of political things just didn't make sense to me. I was like, man, like, we know what the issue is, we know what the problem is, and we know the solution, but we're not really wanting to talk about it sometimes. So I didn't really engage in that way with politics. And at first I was like, man, like, don't you need all sorts of money and connections to even run for office? But eventually, for many reasons, I ended up deciding to put my career to the side. At the time, I did have an engineering job lined up after I graduated, but I decided to put that to the side and run for office, which, at the time I had a job guaranteed. I mean, engineers get paid fairly well, and it wasn't something that I had pretty much spent a lot of time studying for, preparing for. And yeah, so whenever I reached out to my recruiter about that, they were a little surprised. They're like, wait a second, like, we gave you a pretty good offer. Are you sure you don't want to do this? And I told them, no, I'm sure. I mean, I care a lot about the engineering work, but I also care a lot about my community. So I decided to run for office for a multitude of reasons, like I said. One of the big reasons is, growing up, never seeing people invest in your community. I was like, okay, like, what can we do to make sure we bring in more investment in a community that is struggling? And also things like, elevating different voices within the political conversations. Oklahoma is one of those places that tends to be kind of tough for young people, tough for minority groups to get involved politically. And that's one of the big things that motivated me to run for office, to give people more of a voice, show them that someone that looks like them, talks like them, understands their issues, deserves to have a voice and a seat at the table.
Can you talk? I mean, I want to talk about how do we get more people like you into government, and both in your age, in your background, and coming from a STEM background as well. We just need more people with that experience and that approach. Can you talk a little bit about what we could do to make the process more attractive so that we can get more folks like you into all levels of elected life?
Yeah, no, and I think a big factor that contributed to me, being willing to run for office is the mentors I've had. I've definitely leaned on a lot of people that have poured a lot into me, because, and I think if it wasn't for a lot of those individuals, I definitely wouldn't be where I am right now. Since, for one, I'm also first generation, so first gen to go and graduate high school and eventually go and graduate college. First generation citizen as well. So I do come from an immigrant parent from Mexico. And it's one of those things that there's a lot of barriers for people like myself to get involved politically. And because of the mentors I've had, teachers, community leaders, that kind of saw something in me I didn't see in myself, I felt more motivated and had that confidence to be able to see myself doing something like this. And it is one of those things that, because of these leaders, these people that essentially planted some seeds in me, that eventually grew into kind of a passion for service. So I think the more people can pour into, I think, the young people, the young crowd, the more we'll see like leaders being formed. Because like I said, I did a lot of work to support them because I saw that the work they were doing made a difference. It might not have been a huge difference sometimes, but it was enough of a difference to inspire someone like myself to want to see more of that kind of change. And because of them, because of that motivation, I did feel called to run and feel inspired to accept kind of the challenge of putting myself in this position that I never really knew much about. The analogy I like to use is that you throw yourself in the deep end of the pool, not knowing how to swim. And within the realm of politics, there's piranhas and sharks, because politics, a lot of good, a lot of bad, and a lot of messy. But it's just about getting that sense of formulating that sense of passion, I think, within young people. Because a lot of young people, I think, and my generation has grown up always having access to technology, right? So we've had access to all the information going on in the world, and it's a double-edged sword, right? on one hand, there's so much things going on locally, nationally, and globally. And then it's like, man, like what can I as an individual even do about this? So we see a lot of the issues happening around us. And then it's like, okay, is there anything I can even do about it? I think a lot of people care, they just don't know where to start. They don't know what avenues of change could look like for them. So that's kind of been something I've seen, just having more of that access. And I guess on the other hand, when it comes to technology, we also have more access to empathy, to understanding other people's experiences, because, whenever policy is enacted, people are talking about it. They're posting about it, how it directly impacts their lives. And oftentimes you see social media can be a little toxic when it comes to politics at times. But I do think because we have more access to empathy and understanding, we're a lot more connected with the people around us. So it kind of gives you more perspective and more of an idea of how things are impacting people.
Can you tell me a little bit about that pool that you jumped into? How did you learn to swim? How did you avoid getting bitten by the piranhas and sharks, or maybe you didn't, and you're just that's part of the experience as well. But sort of, what was it like when those folks came to you, said, "We want you to run for office"? What was it like running for office? Then what's it been like serving?
Yeah. Oh man, jumping into the pool. It's not easy. That's for sure. I mean, it's definitely, I think at my point in life, I mean, being young, it's give and take. So you do have to sacrifice a bit of things. And to me, it's been one of the best decisions I've ever made, but it's also been one of the hardest decisions, because you do give up a lot sometimes, you are in the public eye, and running for office was no easy feat, that's for sure. Engineers tend to be not, at least I didn't tend to be the most people-oriented person. I love people, but I do need my time to kind of just recuperate energy, because I was always the kind of person that liked to do the work in the background, not really be in the forefront, taking the credit. But being in politics, serving as a state legislator, it is a very public role. So you're out there campaigning, knocking doors, fundraising money. So when it came to, being on the campaign trail, my favorite part was just connecting one-on-one with constituents, knocking their doors and really trying to understand what issues they cared about. It was really cool because, I was knocking doors of, the neighborhood that I pretty much grew up in. And it's a part of town that I care a lot about. And I was fairly involved throughout. So it was really nice to reconnect with people that I had just met whenever I was doing kind of my own work in high school, throughout college, and reconnecting with old friends, meeting new people that you kind of see every here and there, but you never really talk to them. And through those conversations, I was able to formulate what my initial platform looked like, because, going into it as an engineer, it's kind of like, okay, like, can I even implement my engineering mindset into this kind of role? But you really can. At least I was really able to. And I think that's one of the things that helped me be somewhat successful, because we tend to see things a little bit more objectively. I think politics can be very subjective, much more like, okay, like this is how I feel about an issue. And it was really cool to kind of like I kind of saw it as field research, because throughout college, I did a lot of research. I studied air particles. Some people think it's boring. I thought it was fascinating. But so it was kind of like studying not air particles, but just people, trying to really understand where they're coming from, really empathize with their situations, and just building that relationship with them. One of the parts that I didn't like as much, but it's still important within the realm of campaigning, is fundraising. Man, I haven't really been the best at asking for money. And I'm like, okay, like I can do it for someone else, right? I can do it if I'm doing it for an organization, like this is our mission. I was like, okay, like let's try to apply that to this campaign, which my slogan, a good friend of mine that's also a constituent helped me come up with it. It's "The future is ours," or "El futuro es nuestro." Because, my platform focused a lot on young people. The future is ours. We have our whole future to look forward to. And it's one of those things that I really wanted to be future focused with my policy. Like, we have to make sure we don't just think about our next elections, but we think about the next generation. in our decision making. So really thinking long term, thinking sustainably, going back to kind of that engineering mindset. Sustainable systems are a big thing that I kind of focused on within my research and just kind of in general. And one of the things I've learned these, through campaigning and then eventually serving in office, we don't have a lot of sustainable systems within government and within politics, unfortunately. And we kind of see the consequences of that a lot. And that's also one of the things that motivated me to want to run for office, because I was like, there's not a lot of engineers. There's not a lot of people with kind of these kind of mindsets. So we'll see how it goes. And it's been very beneficial. And then going to the second part of your question, I'm just serving in office, man, it's, you think the work starts, once you've gotten the seat, once you've won your election. Because campaigning, it was challenging, but it was really, really insightful and really cool. And it does kind of prepare you for service. So Oklahoma can be tough for a young Democrat because I'm a part of the super minority, right? Within the state House of Representatives, we have 101 members. 81 of those are Republican and 20 are Democrats. Last election cycle, so 2 years ago, we finally picked up our first seat within the past 8 years. So we had been the party had been on the decline, and eventually we were able to kind of start pivoting. So now it's looking more possible for us to win seats as Democrats in Oklahoma. So it's been interesting. And also 2 years ago, I didn't really align myself with any political party. I would have really considered myself more of an independent, which I think a lot of young people tend to have a similar sentiment when it comes to political party. At least a lot of the people that I've talked to. But kind of you start learning more about the issues, more about what's happening, especially with these upcoming national elections. And it's like, okay, let's, at least I knew kind of where I fell in line a little bit more.
I think it's interesting. I want to dive into, using your engineering mind and a sort of future oriented mind where you're trying to think about that next generation. If you were trying to create more sustainable systems in politics and you were no longer in the super minority, but you were in a super majority, what would that look like for your state? Where do you think that there's opportunities to build systems using your engineering skills that are more sustainable over time?
Yeah, no, there's quite a few things. I know when it comes to thinking about sustainable systems, and I guess another engineering concept that I apply within politics is root cause analysis, right? So not really trying to address a symptom, but actually trying to understand what the root cause is. That can be a little more challenging because politics gets in the way. And, a lot of people have different opinions as to what the best approach is as well, which I think is one of the cool things about it. But it's also one of the challenging things about it. But I focus a lot within the realm of, kind of technology, environment. I've been diving more into the realm of education as well, because Oklahoma tends to be a state that lacks a lot within the realm of education, unfortunately. But there's a lot of systems that are very, and it was interesting to see how much the word efficiency was used within government, within politics, which I think levels of efficiency are important because we want to make sure we have systems that are efficient. They flow well and they flow quickly, because when it comes to addressing constituent needs, when it comes to people being able to access state government resources, we want to make it as easy as possible for just people in general. But I think oftentimes there's certain systems that are focused on having too much efficiency. And I know within the realm of engineering, whenever you create a super efficient system, oftentimes there's trade-offs. So because there's too much efficiency, you kind of trade off a bit of that quality aspect. So maybe things don't get considered, certain people get left out. And I think that's one of the big things that we see throughout a lot of systems within Oklahoma. And I think when it comes to the educational system, that's a big one. I represent, like I mentioned earlier, a group of a constituency that's predominantly low-income families and 70% Hispanic. So these are my community is one of those that tends to unfortunately fall through the cracks. because a lot of the systems are designed not really for people that might, have things like language barriers, have things like economic barriers where, economically, a lot of families are having to work more hours or more jobs for not a lot of pay, unfortunately. So whenever a parent, they might have a language barrier and they might be working a lot, they can't be as invested in their students' education, even though they want to be. And I've been diving more deep into what that looks like within our education system, but a lot goes into just how these systems are designed. So just trying to better understand that has been a big focus for me.
How do you, in this super minority, how do you advocate for your community? And the second part of that is, I assume that when your fellow legislators see you, they make a lot of assumptions about what you know and don't know, your age, based on your age, background, etc. How do you break down some of those assumptions and then also advocate for your community?
Yes, no, I think there is a lot of there's a lot of assumptions. Just whenever I talk to people, both within my own party and within the majority, uh, being young, being Latino, I think a lot of people think because I see myself more. I do see myself more as a moderate when it comes to a lot of the politics going on. Some things, I mean, I know I'm like, okay, like there's kind of and I think a lot of people, because I'm young, they're like, oh, like, man, like this guy doesn't know a lot, doesn't really uh, doesn't have a lot of real world experience when it comes to things. And I mean, in some instances, I get it, right. I don't really have a family yet, so um, but I've been able to contribute a lot through my experience because one of the things I've seen that's completely different with any previous generation is just how we're interacting with the economy. So things like, buying a house, things like being able to afford college. A lot of these things have become so much more inaccessible for the younger generations. And it's one of those things that most of the people I work with are twice my age, right? Right now I'm 25 years old, and most people that I work with are 50, 55, 60. I think the age average in Oklahoma is around 55 years old. So they grew up in a time where they had a easier access to build that kind of wealth, to, be able to work one job, pay for college, and then be able to buy a house and start a family. That's a bit tougher now, for I guess a multitude of reasons. So a lot of my time is spent trying to show people like, hey, like, things are a little bit different than the way you grew up. And I think a lot of people have appreciated gaining a little bit more insight from someone like myself that's lived through that and that might have more access to a lot of people that are experiencing something similar. But also, I think a lot of people think, given that I, at the national level right now, immigration is one of the biggest issues, if not the biggest issue. And they're like, man, like this guy's big into immigration. And it is one of those things I focus on a lot, not because I want to, more because I have to. And we've done a lot of good work to organize, to mobilize people, and fight back against kind of poorly written anti-immigrant bills within Oklahoma, because, like I said, very conservative state. And I think it's one of those states that's at the forefront of a lot of this kind of hyper-conservative movement, especially when it comes to immigration. But when it comes to issues I've been able to leverage, I mean, technology and environment have been big issues for me, given that as an engineer, I did a lot of research within the realm of collecting air particles. So I studied little particulates in the air to understand the chemical composition, and then how do these chemicals impact human health, soil health, and water health, around oil and gas sites, around other type of kind of like pollutant sites. So I didn't realize how much I was able to apply that into politics. But I mean, Oklahoma's a very energy-based state. That's one of our biggest sectors. Aerospace is also one of the biggest sectors in Oklahoma. So it's been nice to kind of been able to contribute to those areas. Things like artificial intelligence as well. I mean, I've always kind of developed systems, never really done policy behind them. So it's been really cool to see that side of what policy even looks like, integrating things like artificial intelligence into education, into state government, or into the healthcare systems. So it's been really cool to contribute in those ways as well. and just learn. Because I also recognize that there's a lot I don't know. But a lot of people within the political world like to talk, and I guess I'm one of those people as well. So it's been really cool to be surrounded by people that are just my experts in so many awesome things. So
I want to talk to you about that AI work because it's really interesting, and especially from your perspective. But I do want to give the listeners a sense of some of these anti-immigration measures because they may be coming to their state soon, or maybe even to the federal government, God forbid, soon. So can you tell us what they are, sort of how you mobilize your community against them, and what the prospects look like going forward?
yeah, so this year we saw. This is just my second year serving in office. So given that it's an election year, I think this is one of those at the federal level. That immigration is one of those issues that tends to come up a lot during years like this. And we saw around 5 anti-immigrant bills. Some were kind of just like, what the heck is this person thinking? Just wanting to essentially create crimes and send people to jail. And I'm like, okay, like how are we gonna? I care a lot about the human aspect of it, but a lot of my colleagues tend to only really listen to the numbers, listen to the money, what's the cost, what's the implementation look like. So I've been trying to reframe a lot of kind of my approach to kind of put things in terms that people will first off listen and try to understand. I'll kind of more focus on the biggest bill that we saw and the one that unfortunately did pass. It was HB 4156. It's a bill similar to what you saw in Texas with SB4 and Florida. They had another anti-immigrant bill. But essentially this bill created a new crime called impermissible occupation. So anyone that is residing within Oklahoma and essentially came to the United States without permission, unlawfully, then they would be sentenced to 1 to 2 years within prison, have to pay a certain amount of fine, and within 72 hours after serving their sentence, leave the state of Oklahoma. And it didn't really have much exceptions outside of any of DACA recipients, so deferred action for childhood arrivals. And it was incredibly broad, incredibly vague in the way it was written because it didn't account for so many different situations, right? Like if there's, maybe there's like how would this be implemented within like, okay, is there a difference with how a minor's prosecuted versus an adult? It didn't make that differentiation. And I remember being a part of a lot of groups talking about the bill. I was like, man, like so many questions came up, and it's like, man, like if we try to understand this logically, it's kind of gonna go crazy. Because the purpose wasn't necessarily to create good policy. It was more to bring a political kind of talking points because, since immigration is one of those big issues, it's one of those issues that a lot of people within the majority in Oklahoma use for their next elections. You're like, oh, we're doing what we can to be hard on the southern border, which I recognize that, there is aspects where there is somewhat of a crisis going on in the southern border. But sometimes people don't want to talk about like real solutions to the issue. And this was an example of that because, one of the big conversations we had, I'm also a member of the Oklahoma Legislative Latino Caucus. And we were like, okay, if we want to talk about enforcement and having something like this, let's try to have more of a balanced and a comprehensive approach, right? Like, let's recognize that we've had undocumented Oklahomans here for decades that have been contributing through paying taxes using an ITIN or an individual tax ID number in the millions of dollars. There's people that have contributed so much through just work within key industries like agriculture, hospitality, and construction, because a very large percentage of those industries are essentially, a lot of the laborers are undocumented immigrants. And one of the big things that does drive this immigration is our economy, right? There's a huge need for jobs to be filled, and there's a pool of people that are looking for jobs. So it's a combination of somewhat of an ease of going through the border and then jobs just being readily available. That's kind of like what's fueled a lot of that surplus in immigration. And it's a complicated issue, but we were able to mobilize a huge community within Oklahoma because a lot of people within the immigrant community, within just the community at large, recognizes, okay, this is a community of people that contributes in so many different ways to the state and to the nation. Not only supporting their families, but supporting their neighboring community, supporting the entire state through just the surplus in tax dollars and so much other things. So we did a lot of work to organize. I know one of the big things is just creating this peaceful demonstration at the Capitol to show people like, hey, like we're not criminals, not terrorists, not traffickers, because oftentimes that's what the narrative that is thrown out. It's people that are hard workers, family members, congregation members, people that are doing a lot to contribute. And really showing the reality of who this community is, because oftentimes, a lot of my colleagues, they don't surround themselves with people like the constituents I represent. So showing them and getting them to like better empathize, like, hey, these are the people that we're impacting. They're just, typical people that are doing this as much as they can to support themselves and contribute to their families and state as a whole, because it's a community of people that really values the American dream. They come to the United States because they want to realize what the American dream is, right? Being able to work hard and really be able to move forward and find opportunities where maybe their countries of origin, they couldn't find that. So that's kind of one of the big areas that really inspires me. I mean, that's kind of an aspect that my family and my parents really instilled in me, seeing them work hard and sometimes long hours for little pay, to not see any benefits, right? Because if you're undocumented, you don't have any benefits. And I think that's a misconception a lot of people have, that, oh, they're not paying taxes. They're taking all these state benefits, but they don't qualify for anything really. They're paying money into, Social Security, Medicare, things that they will never see, essentially, not having a retirement. So there's a lot of misconceptions, a lot of kind of misinformation that we've had to combat. And the big way we were able to organize is through just different town halls, through social media, and just bringing people to the Capitol, people that would have never seen themselves at the Capitol, because it can be a scary place for some communities. So showing them that, people like myself and like other leaders are doing the work inside the Capitol to make sure that community is being represented well, but also kind of giving them that sense of ownership. Like, we have to also do work outside the Capitol to make sure, one, people are educated, people are empowered to know that they can make a change, and then people know what kind of action they can take. And kind of a small example of that, one of the projects I've been working on is called Tú Tienes una voz, You Have a Voice. And it's essentially a community forum, a series of different forums that I've organized in partnership with different organizations to essentially amplify what civic engagement within the Hispanic and immigrant community looks like through education, empowerment, and action. And the big goal with that is to essentially impact change and reform the lack of civic engagement that we see within different communities. That one was kind of more geared towards the Spanish-speaking community, but it's, at least within Oklahoma City, it's a quarter of the population. And statewide, it's about 13% of the population.
Wow. Can you are you concerned at all that some of these laws not only impact folks who are undocumented, but actually give pretext and license to people just to harass folks in your community who are maybe citizens, but maybe stopped and asked to prove their citizenship in a way that others may not be, and that it could have an even broader impact than just that one particular part of the population in your state.
Yes, no, and actually, I'm glad you brought that up. That's not something I mentioned, but when it comes to the anti-immigrant bill that we saw, we had conversations with law enforcement as well to be like, okay, like how, like, well, what can y'all tell us about how this bill could be enforced? And they mentioned that for one, they were never looped into the conversation as to okay, like what this bill would do, because their main job is public safety. Making sure that people can reach out to them whenever they see a crime or they're victims of a crime. And they've spent a lot of time, just in the conversations I had, they mentioned that they spent a lot of time trying to build trust within the immigrant, the Hispanic community, because it's one of those, because of the rhetoric that's thrown out, this community, a lot of state leaders, unfortunately, say that the immigrants are criminals, terrorists, and traffickers. That does kind of create this narrative that, anyone that looks like an immigrant is a criminal. And oftentimes, people look at someone like myself, brown skinned, maybe I have a slight accent, someone that looks like, in their eyes, an immigrant. There is that sense of kind of racial profiling, because in that conversation with law enforcement, they're like, the way this bill is written, we can't enforce it without essentially racial profiling, because there's no training involved, there's no additional resources, and that does kind of instill fear and anxiety within the community, and it kind of goes back and undoes a lot of the work they've been doing in building trust, because then it's like, oh, like if I witness a crime or I'm a victim of a crime, and Oklahoma has huge rates of domestic violence, unfortunately, then, and maybe I might be undocumented, or a family member even is undocumented. Am I putting myself or that person at risk? So am I even going to feel inclined to want to call them? That was a conversation that I remember having with a lot of community members, because they're like, well, can we even call if we see a crime or if we are victims of one? Because then are we then at fault for a crime because we put it like outed ourselves? So it does open that door, unfortunately, because oftentimes, people do associate what an undocumented immigrant might look like with someone that just might have Hispanic features.
Yeah, so scary. So moving on to something potentially scary, maybe something potentially optimistic. Let's talk about your AI work, and how, specifically as an engineer, how you think about making AI policy for a technology that's evolving quickly, and when we aren't entirely clear how all the use cases. How do you think about those regulations, and what's been your work in the legislature look like?
Yeah, so far we've started a few conversations in Oklahoma when it comes to artificial intelligence. I've had the opportunity to serve both nationally and locally within kind of some AI commissions, within integrating AI into the classroom, and also hosting bipartisan interim studies on the topic of AI, which has been really cool. And so far we've done quite a bit of work. I know Oklahoma already put out kind of a list of recommendations into what AI integration could possibly look like. This kind of happened after the interim study, the bipartisan interim study I organized with another young member. And a big focus is just making sure that we because there is that fear, right? Like a lot of people think about artificial intelligence, and they're like, and even in conversations I have with other legislators, they're like, man, is this going to be some kind of like rogue technology, like Skynet from iRobot, that's going to pretty much take control? And within, I think, the next few years, that shouldn't be happening. Fingers crossed, right? You never know what evil science, like computer scientists, could be designing out there. But I think the big focus, and I think you said it well, focusing more on the use cases, because the technology is like any other tool. It's like any other software. And AI has been here for decades, used in different ways, but because of things like generative AI and, GPT becoming that much more accessible just to the general public, And it is something that's impacting anything and everything. I mean, we're seeing it being impacting everything, really. So far, my focuses have been education, healthcare, and state government. Right now, I'm part of a regional commission that deals with AI in education. And we want to really focus on just, for one, making sure people understand the technology and know how to leverage it. Because a big topic of conversation that we've had with industry, with researchers, is, AI might not really take your job. There are certain jobs that were kind of like, okay, like, they might be impacted a lot more than others. But for the most part, AI is going to augment the work people do. So it's going to help people kind of do things more efficiently, more effectively. But then it's like, okay, like there's certain kind of roles that might not be as needed, right? And then it's like, how do we make sure, people do still have access to a job and people are able to leverage the technology, and maybe we need to slow certain aspects of it. I know within education, the big focus is, okay, like how do we provide more professional development opportunities for teachers to know how to leverage the technology, to understand, okay, how students might be using it, how can they use it effectively? Because, everyone has access to a phone. And if you're in high school, I mean, I think a lot of people can now have a new tool to cheat. But it's one of those things that cheaters are always going to cheat. There was I think some research that was done that the amount of people that kind of, had academic kind of integrity issues, that didn't really change, but now they just have a different tool to use. So it's one of those things that it has opportunities, and I think we need to really take advantage of those opportunities when it comes to making things kind of more effective for people within things like education, but also kind of recognizing that we need to think about risk, right? Like, what are some data privacy conversations we need to be having? Things like impact assessments, right? Like, whenever we look at a system, look at a technology, is it really doing what we want it to do? Because oftentimes transparency is an issue. So how can we make sure we know that the technology is doing what we want it to? So my approach has been more focused on trust. So making sure that we establish systems that provide transparency and provide accountability. Because right now we have ways to hold people accountable whenever they make poor decisions, but we don't really have a lot of systems in place to hold a technology accountable whenever we're depending on it to make oftentimes a consequential decision. So kind of creating those guardrails has been a focus, because oftentimes, technologies are used to make a consequential decision. Can someone access a certain service based off of the information that we know of them? So making sure that, for one, we account for the bias, because every system is going to be biased. And there's intentional bias, right? So we want an AI system to give us the right information compared to the wrong information. But there's also user bias, right? How much trust are we giving these systems? Within the realm of healthcare, I had a conversation with radiologists, and they're wanting to make sure we have specialized human oversight, because oftentimes, doctors that maybe aren't radiologists, so they're analyzing a X-ray of what could be a tumor, and the AI system, using this thing called computer vision, is telling them, like, okay, because of the thousands of images I have that have been fed to me of what a tumor looks like, I think this is a tumor. But that's a very narrow kind of AI, right? So it can only really identify what it looks like. We still need that specialized human oversight to understand the context, to understand, okay, like, I know all this history of this patient. I know kind of like what environmental factors, what kind of like maybe genetic factors, things that the AI can't tell me. So we still need that sense of specialized human oversight in different areas. So that's kind of been the conversation within the realm of healthcare, because they're creating all sorts of new technologies that are integrating AI tech within them. So making sure that people can still, even though AI can help them see things better or help them kind of prioritize certain patients that might have something more of need, making sure that there's still that human aspect involved, because there's still, I think, a lot of things we don't know about the technology. And that's why trust has been kind of one of those key areas I've been focusing on within artificial intelligence.
Makes tons of sense. I want to thank you for jumping into the pool and then jumping into the pool with us here at New Deal so that we can share your experiences organizing your community, addressing AI, across with other leaders across the country who may be facing the same issues or soon to face the same issues. And it's incredibly valuable to have your voice in the New Deal. And we're grateful you joined us today.
Well, thank you so much for having me. And it's been a pleasure having a conversation with you. So,
An Honorable Profession is a New Deal Leaders podcast. Thanks to the team at New Deal for producing this episode. We encourage you to bring honor to public service, and because we keep things honorable, no tax dollars are used in the making of this podcast.
This podcast is part of the Democracy Group.